And again, I thank everybody for coming out. This is a bit of a challenge with the parking, but I really appreciate that you've come out. And we've got a really important topic to talk about. And in my opinion, it's the most important topic facing this country right now, which is the federal government is squashing state sovereignty and individual sovereignty. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about a possible path forward where we ought to be focusing our energy. So tonight we're going to talk about, first I'm going to define the problem. So I want to make it clear what we're talking about here so there's no confusion. That's going to lead to a discussion about the collapse of federalism. And I'm going to talk about that very important concept in the structure of our country. I'm going to talk about Washington, D.C., where, in my opinion, the Constitution is now completely ignored by all branches of the government. And what we need to do is think about what we're going to do about that. And beneath that is the concept of states' rights, which in my opinion is the last hope. And we need to think about how we're going to leverage that kind of power to change the environment we're in. So as was mentioned, this is part one of a two-part presentation. The second part will be next week, and that will be more action-oriented. Once we have this discussion today, what is it we're going to actually do going forward to make a difference? We'll talk about some of the next steps in the process of getting this movement going. There are a couple of assignments today related to the cards that have been handed out for you. And then if we've got time at the end, there'll be a little bit of question and answer. So what's the problem? Well, the biggest part of the problem, in my opinion, is the very fabric of the country is changing. The culture of the country is changing. When it first started, it was a country that was focused on the ideas of individual sovereignty and freedom, free minds, free markets, free people. With that came the responsibility of being a responsible citizen, taking care of yourself, taking care of your community, and taking care of each other. That's changed. I don't know if you've noticed, but the focus in our culture now, particularly as the younger generations are coming up, is on collective action. It's not that individual responsibility or individual freedom anymore. It's what can we do as a government. And it's more about obedience to authority and obedience to experts. We've lost the concept of being obedient to the Constitution. We're now obedient to these mysterious experts in Washington, D.C. So what's happening, and the reason this is a big problem, is that our government, particularly the federal government, is increasingly becoming the agent of this cultural change in our country. Because originally, the purpose of the government, if you understand the Constitution and why it was structured the way it was so that we could protect those things called life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and property. Well, the government is less that now. It's doing a lot less of that. In fact, I would argue it's actually assaulting those things. And it's doing it in the name of this cultural shift, this collective action, this social justice kind of thing, and we've lost that protection of our rights. As that happens, as the government starts to change its mission to doing those kinds of things, you start to see the amount of money that it taxes and spends increase, and you also see the amount of control that it imposes on the country increase. So I would argue, and I'm going to argue as I go through this presentation, that we now live in a post-constitutional society, at least as far as the federal government is concerned. They're ignoring it, and we really don't have any redress directly in Washington right now. And in fact, personally, I'll tip my hand a little bit, I feel a little bit like the gentlemen Jefferson and Adams and Madison and those guys did in 1775 when they were thinking about London. That's actually how I see Washington, D.C. right now. I see it as a distant power that's imposing itself, and we have no voice in what it's doing. And that's exactly how the founders saw London at that time. So we've got to think about what we're going to do, and we're going to talk about some of that today. So the big issue that the founders wrestled with was this whole issue of federalism. When we fought the Revolutionary War, and it was a war, we had the Battle of Yorktown, we had the firing on Lexington Green and all the things that come with a war. But the biggest part of a revolution wasn't the war, it was that it was a philosophical revolution. It was a massive, unprecedented change in the relationship between people and governments. Because up until that point, governments were always supreme. They basically anointed themselves as leaders, and everyone else was expected to be subject to them. And the founders rejected that. They rejected King George. They rejected all of Parliament. They not only rejected those people specifically, they rejected the concept of being subservient to any power, that we the people are sovereign, that political power arises with us, and that we pick our leaders, we pick our constitution, and we decide how the country's going to run. That was a tremendous change. It literally turned all of history upside down and all of political philosophy upside down. It was the biggest political event in the history of the world. So as this happened, the founders thought, well, we're getting rid of the king, we're getting rid of Parliament, we're getting rid of this great monarchy in the British Empire. How do we stop that from ever happening again? How do we stop that great mass of centralized power from taking over us again? That was really, if you read the Federalist Papers, if you think about what went into the construction of the Constitution, that was the thing that was on their mind. How do we stop this from ever happening again? Now, they also had another issue to wrestle with, and this is where the tough balancing act came in, which is the 13 states thought, there actually is some value in having a federation amongst the states that, for the purpose of common defense, for instance, because they were living in a world where the European colonial powers were a big threat. Spain and France and England. We had to think about our military defense, and the colonies thought, it might be a good idea if we had a federation. They also had to engage with those foreign powers. And one of the things they feared was that each of those foreign powers, the Englands, the Frances, the Spains, would work the states against each other with various treaties and with various intrigues and various initiatives. And we in the States didn't want us working against each other. We wanted to work together, and we wanted to present a united front to the rest of the world. We also wanted to facilitate commerce, because capitalism was just beginning at that time. Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations the same year Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But they realized we needed free markets, that this concept of liberty, political liberty, went hand in hand with free markets. And they didn't want the states setting tariffs against each other or blocking commerce. They really wanted the states to work together as a giant free market. And ultimately, they also wanted to protect our liberty. That's one thing they saw as being one of the main responsibilities of the federal government they were thinking about creating was, we have to protect this liberty that we just fought and risked our lives for. So they had this balancing act. They hated centralized power, but they also knew we had to have some federation, some federal structure in order to proceed with this vision that we had. So as they wrestled with the Constitution, that was the issue they were wrestling with. If you read the Constitution and think about it, almost the entire structure of it is a series of checks and balances to prevent the federal government from taking too much power. That's literally what the document is intended to do. Now, the purpose of it is to protect our rights, the sovereignty of the states, and the sovereignty of individual people. But that document, the Constitution, was structured to prevent the federal government from becoming big and powerful again. So they had a lot of checks and balances that were built into it. The very concept of a constitution was very new to the world at that time. So the purpose of the Constitution was to put down in writing what powers we are assigning to the federal government and limiting it to just that. It wasn't the king who was all-powerful, Caesar who was all-powerful, the dictator who was all-powerful. We the people are assigning certain rights to this federal government, or not certain rights, certain powers, and that's all we're assigning to this federal government. So that was one check. Another check was the three branches of government that we're all familiar with. The legislative, where they make laws, the executive, where they enforce laws, and the judiciary, where they decide, hey, if we got a dispute, who wins. So those three branches were designed to offset each other and to check each other. And if one was getting out of line, the others would sort of get it back in line with the Constitution. Another important check and balance that's built into the Constitution to limit the federal government's power is the notion of a bicameral legislature. And by that I mean we have two pieces of our legislature. We have the House of Representatives and the Senate. They had two very different functions in the eyes of the founders. And those functions were meant to play against each other and make sure the government didn't do anything silly. So the House is a very populist kind of structure. It was back then, it was elected directly by the people. The representatives were apportioned according to population. So it was intended to be a reflection of the will of the people and give people the opportunity to influence the government. That was the House. The Senate was much different because it was apportioned by state. Each state, big or small, didn't matter what population, had 2 senators. And these senators had longer terms, and they were actually picked by the states originally when the Constitution was founded. It wasn't until the 17th Amendment that there was direct election of senators. The whole purpose of that was to give the states their influence in this thing that they were creating called the federal government. So that check and balance was, hey, the people may want something really bad, but the states in their wisdom may say, no, that's not really a good idea. So you have to actually get legislature through both of those organizations for it to be implemented. Another check and balance is the executive veto, where the president can say, well, the House may have approved it, the Senate may have approved it, but they're still nuts, and I think it's a bad idea. I veto it. It's another check on federal power. And the override that goes with that veto is an additional check where the Senate and the House may say, well, you're nuts, Mr. President. There's enough of us to override that veto. All of this was intended to slow down big changes, and it was also intended to prevent the federal government from gaining power it shouldn't have. Now, the concept of federalism, which isn't directly defined in the Constitution, but it was what caused the states to come together and create a Constitution. The concept of federalism is recognized in some of the amendments to the Constitution, the original one, the 9th and 10th Amendments, and we're going to talk about that today. But in reality, in all of this, despite the fact that we were creating our Constitution, the whole intent of it was that the states and the people retained their sovereignty and retained their power, and we were creating the federal government, and that federal government takes its direction from us, the people, we the people. The last thing I want to talk about, again, it's not mentioned directly in the Constitution, but it's the principle of subsidiarity. And again, if you read the founders and what they wrote at the time they were crafting the Constitution, they really believed in empowering the individual, that as much power as possible in our society and as much freedom as possible in a society should be given to individuals. And if there is a need to have a local government or a state government or a federal government, it should have as little power as possible, that we should move power as far down in the society as we can possibly move it right down to the individual. So this is my simple diagram of all of that. If you look at the bottom of that pyramid, it says individual sovereignty. And what this represents is that freedom and power was supposed to be going to the individuals. That was the foundation of our society. And if you looked at where's the power in this society, most of it should be at that individual level where you live your lives, where you can choose where you shop, where you work, where you go to school, who you associate with, what you say in public. That power was all supposed to be ours. Those decisions are ours. Now, we did recognize, and the founders recognized, well, we need a little bit of government. They weren't anarchists, so the local government may need a little bit of power, the state governments may need a little less, and the federal government should have almost no power inside the country. It really should be focused externally for the most part. So if you look at that pyramid of power, the thing that should have the least power in our society is the federal government, at least according to our founding. The thing that should have the most power is us. So where are we today? Here's my blunt assessment. The checks and the balances that were put in the Constitution have simply failed at this point. Failed because Washington is simply ignoring them, and they're getting away with it. And to some extent, I'll say it bluntly again, we're letting them get away with it. If you look at the trend of spending in Washington, which is a good measure of how much power an organization has, spending is skyrocketing. If you look at the rules and regulations that they've implemented, there's more and more every year. And I've got a couple of charts I want to show you. This one is related to spending. You don't have to see the detail on the chart, but this is a chart since World War II. So it's in the last 60 or 70 years. And this is the trend of federal spending in America. And you can see that it just keeps going up year after year. The last entry on the chart is about $4 trillion. I think last year we spent $8 trillion or some ridiculous number like that. But the important point to notice here is that all of that spending actually reflects increased federal government power, because in the end, it's all about money. Whoever controls the money is going to make the decisions in this country. So another way to look at it is federal regulations and laws. And again, this is since World War II, and the measurement on here is the number of pages that is in the Code of Federal Regulations. That's a formal book that gets published. So right now, the way it stands today, we've got about 200,000 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, it didn't start out like that, and this is just a trend in the last 60 or 70 years. If you go way back to the beginning of the country, the federal government had almost no rules and regulations. They let us live our lives and run the country. So these are two, in my opinion, critical measurements that this is just simply getting out of control. The government's sucking up all the money, and now they're telling us what we can do in almost every aspect of our lives with these rules and regulations. So how did this happen? How did we start from this revolutionary idea of limited government and individual sovereignty and end up with this monstrosity in Washington, despite the fact that we had crafted this Constitution and we had set in place all of these checks and balances? So I want to take you on a little walk of what I think are the key milestones and how that power was eaten away, or our power was eaten away, and the federal government grabbed that power in a series of steps. It's sort of like being eaten to death by ducks. But the biggest start of it was the Civil War. And I'm not going to suggest that the North was right or the South was right or anything about slavery. I'm just observing a historical fact that wars are crises, and wars forced the federal government to take extraordinary steps, most of which was to suspend the Bill of Rights, suspend our rights, and create whole new federal powers that didn't exist before the war, including the right to tax. That was the first time the federal government had ever implemented an income tax. It created the first welfare state at that point. They imprisoned political prisoners in an island in New York Harbor. If you look at the history of it, the federal government took on enormous powers during that war, and to some extent never let go of them after that. What made it a little worse was that period after the war, which is called Reconstruction, where they wanted to bring the southern states back into the Union and make sure their rebelliousness never happened again. That was another step forward in the power of the federal government, because then he basically said, I don't care about states' rights. We are going to dictate to the southern states, this is how it's going to be, and that's how it was. And so that power was never really relinquished at that point. It was a dramatic change in the relationship of us to our government at that point in time. So a couple of things that happened in 1916 are really important, because the government was taking on more and more power, but power needs money. And so two things happened both in 1916, and again, this was during a period of war. It's funny how wars trigger changes in our culture that are probably not good. But the Federal Reserve Act was implemented in 1916, which basically gave the government control over the banking system and the power to print money. And the 16th Amendment, which enabled the federal government to tax incomes formally. So both of those things are how the government gets its money now. And that was a dramatic change. The founders never envisioned a government that needed trillions and trillions of dollars to perform a function that was very, very limited. So the fact that they now had access to this money opened the floodgates. There's some other things that happened over time that are related to the government creating new programs, new entitlements, and transfers of wealth from some people to other people. So like FDR's New Deal during the Great Depression. Again, another thing triggered by a crisis where it changed, again, the relationship between people and their government. The federal government took even more power and said, only we can solve the Great Depression. And so all kinds of new programs, entitlements, spending, departments came out of that. But even farther on, a similar thing with Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society, where we've got to solve poverty and social and racial injustice. And so what came out of that? More entitlements, more spending, more government control. And then Obamacare was another step in that direction where they took 20% of the economy and said, this really ought to be a federal responsibility. We need to move closer towards a single-payer health insurance program and give the government control over this. So what you see is a progressive, and I use the word progressive purposefully, a progressive erosion of our individual rights and our sovereignty and a continual growth in the federal government. A couple of other things I want to point out here that are really important. I've got on here something called the Wickered Supreme Court case, which you may or may not have heard of. It doesn't get a lot of publicity, but in my opinion, it was one of the daggers in the heart of state sovereignty and individual sovereignty. What happened was, right after World War II, people were concerned about the price of food and who's going to grow it and whatnot. So the federal government decided, well, we're going to get involved in that. We're going to tell farmers what they can produce and what they can't produce. So there was a farmer in Ohio who said, you know what, all right, they're passing out these rules about who can produce what, but I'm just going to grow some food for my own family on my farm. And the federal government sued him and said, you can't do that. You can't grow food on your own farm for your own family. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the federal government's argument was that this falls under interstate commerce. And the counter argument was, well, how can that be? I live in Ohio, I'm just feeding my family. And their argument was, well, markets are affected by everything that happens. So even you growing your own food and you deciding you're going to eat your own food affects the price of things in markets everywhere. And so the federal government used the Commerce Clause to basically say, bluntly, we can control everything because we can make an argument that everything that you do affects everything in the United States. And that logic has been used to expand the power of the government. And when you think about things that are happening now and more in the future, like climate change, well, if they could make the argument that everything you do for yourself in an economy justifies the federal government from intervening, they're going to make the same argument for climate change, that everything you do that affects the climate, every car you drive, every gas you burn in your house, every light bulb you lead on, that all affects this thing that we all have to worry about. The federal government is the only thing that can solve it. It is now going to give them the power to do anything it wants to us. One final point, and this one really sits in my craw, is COVID-19. Again, following my point that crises like wars and Great Depressions and pandemics are when the government says, wow, I'm going to jump into this with both feet, and I'm going to take control of everything. So the federal government basically suspended the Bill of Rights during the COVID-19 crisis. They told you what you could put into your body, what you can't put into your body. Can you work? Can you run a business? Can you go to school? It basically suspended all of our rights and said, we're going to take over it all. It's really a frightening thing because even though the pandemic is a terrible thing, climate change, which is, I think, in some people's minds, a bigger threat to the planet, think of what's going to happen when they declare that to be the true crisis that requires us, again, to suspend our rights, suspend the Bill of Rights, and empower the federal government to do anything it wants in pursuit of climate change. So I want to point out a couple of things about this growth. The first is, and this is a really important concept, and it's been true throughout history, it's not new to America, political power has a ratchet function. Now, many of you probably know what a ratchet is, but it's a wrench that when you turn a bolt and you pull it one way, it actually turns the bolt. When you return it the other way, it's in neutral and doesn't unscrew it. It's the same thing with political power. Once you start giving power to a government, it's just like a ratchet. They're just going to take more and more of it. Why is that? Well, think about what lawmakers do. I mean, any government where you've got a collection of lawmakers in a legislature, anywhere in the world, anywhere in history, they all get together in a room and they say, well, we're lawmakers. What do? I got an idea. Let's make laws. And they just make more and more of them. They never undo them. So that's one factor that drives that. The other is money. And I'm going to be very blunt here again that, first of all, politicians are funded by lobbyists largely. So those politicians, when they get to Washington, they know who's paid the bill. And it's not us, by the way. It's those big multinational corporations, the banking industries, the tech giants, the communication giants, the media giants. Those are the people paying the bills, and the piper marches to their tune. But what's even more disturbing is politicians know that, okay, I'm getting funded for my campaigns by these lobbyists. Okay, that's one thing, but I still have to actually get people to vote for me. So how do I do that? Well, I bribe them. And I do it by, I'm going to take your money, and I'm going to start these programs, and it's all going to be wonderful because you'll get this benefit and this entitlement and this whatever and this infrastructure. And so that's the game they play. But that's all just more power for the government. They're not bribing you with less government. They're always bribing you with more government. So those two things, where lawmakers exist to make laws, and the whole funding structure of this is going to push everything towards more and more government all the time. So that's the secret of progressivism. It's just every year, every election, every new administration, it's just let's take more, let's take more, let's take more. And that's what's happened. And that's actually the Achilles heel of pure democracy, that if you don't have a thing called the Constitution, which is what the founders really understood, if you just let government run amok like that, it will take everything. And right now, it's even taken the Constitution itself. That's going to be one of my points. So we've gotten to that point psychologically where a lot of people in this country think the government's the fixer of all things. And I don't know if you hear this in discussions, but anytime a problem comes up, I keep hearing more and more, well, we got to get the government involved. We got to get the government to fix it. We got to have a new program. We got to have a new this, got to have a new that. Well, wait a minute. If you make the government the fixer of all things, they control all things. And if the government controls all things, the states control nothing, and you control nothing. And that's where we're headed. Again, I've made this point a couple of times. I'm going to keep saying it because I believe it. The federal government can essentially do anything it pleases now. The only thing that stops it is maybe a little bit of fear that we'll take up pitchforks and torches and march on Washington. That's the only thing stopping them from whatever they want to do right now. Most of the Constitution is gone. So I'm going to pick at the scab a little bit because I really want to bring this point home. But here's some of the ways that the federal government has overstepped its bounds. The whole COVID thing, which I talked about, where they just basically suspended the Bill of Rights and said, you know, even with health care, well, you can't take ivermectin, but I'll stick this needle in your arm, and you have to take that needle in your arm. I don't care what you think. I don't care what your doctor says. That's just what's going to happen. The whole concept of wealth transfers. Pick up the Constitution someday and see where it says in there that, yeah, we can take trillions of people from these people and bring it over here and give it to these other people. There's nothing like that in there. That violates the whole premise of individual liberty, and private property is just destroyed by that whole notion. Education. The federal government has stuck its nose in education, and it's coercively, through revenue sharing and block grants, is forcing things like CRT, Common Core. It's stuck its nose into the whole student debt fiasco, and in my opinion, that's why we have a student debt fiasco, is because of the government. Nationalizing healthcare. We've got Obamacare, but they want to move to single payer. They want to move to Medicare for all. They're going to stick their nose deeper and deeper into that. The whole concept of block grants, where the government taxes you, takes the money to Washington, takes its cut for all its bureaucrats and lobbyists and salaries in Washington, and then says, hey, I'll send you a little bit back to your states, but oh, by the way, there's strings attached to it. And we're going to send you this money. That was yours in the beginning, but there's these strings, and you got to kind of follow our rules and our regulations now if you want that money. If you don't want the money, you don't have to follow the rules. Well, wait a minute, that was our money to begin with. You're going to see a lot more interference in interstate commerce, particularly in regard to energy as the climate change thing heats up. Another thing that really sits in my craw is the FBI and Homeland Security is being used now not to chase criminals and gangsters and foreign terrorists, it's chasing us. I mean, if you go to a education board meeting, by the way, you're the terrorist now. And guess who's watching you? Homeland Security and the FBI. The worst thing, and this doesn't get nearly enough attention in my opinion, is what I call extranational subservience. And by that I mean, when the founders created the Constitution, they wanted to give power to us, maybe a little bit to the states, maybe a little bit to the federal government. Nowhere in there Does it say we're going to give power to foreign entities? Nowhere. I mean, that violates every concept of sovereignty that ever existed. So this idea that, well, they said we have to do this in the Paris Climate Accord, so I guess we have to do this. Paris. I pick up the Constitution of Paris now mentioned in the Constitution. The World Health Organization. Well, the World Health Organization says we got to do this. Who is who? I mean, that's nonsensical. The Constitution doesn't say I have to do that. The Constitution says I'm in charge here, not some entity in some other country that I don't even know who the hell they are or what they're doing. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but they're just dipping their toes into the water. You ought to be terrified right now of what this federal government is going to do. I mean, they're talking about replacing the electoral college with national popular vote. The whole intent of that is to do away the power of the states in the electoral process. We're talking about allocating senators by population rather than by state. Again, that's another attempt to take away state power and give it to the federal government. Eliminating the filibuster is the same thing. It's taking the teeth out of the Senate's control over the legislative process. They want to make Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico states. Well, the whole purpose of that is to throw a few more senators in there that are on the wrong side of the aisle. But you look at reparations, the whole Build Back Better thing, which is just another social justice initiative. They want to federalize election laws. Can you imagine those criminals? I'm going to be blunt, that's my nature. Those criminals in Washington are going to say, we're going to control the election process now, not you states. Yeah, that's going to end well. Voting rights for illegal immigrants. Again, the whole purpose is flood the country with people who don't believe in the concept of property rights, individual sovereignty, and we're just going to get more government from that. They want to pack the Supreme Court. We have sometimes a fairly conservative Supreme Court that makes the people who are the elitists in control in Washington unhappy because they want unlimited power. So their solution is, hey, let's just add some more justices, and by the way, I'll pick them. You're going to see more and more reliance on executive orders. I mean, where's that in the Constitution? Where did we empower the president to just say, today we're doing this, we're doing that, I'm canceling this, you can't do that? It's absurd what's going to happen. And not only the president, but all these unelected bureaucrats that are in Washington, these thousands and thousands of people who have the ability to make laws and enforce those laws and make your life miserable. Where did they come from? Where is that in the Constitution? We're just going to see more of that. The worst thing is this cultural shift to follow the scientists, particularly the scientists who are government approved. You don't follow those other scientists, just the ones that are government approved. I know, by the way, when you do that, just stop following this thing called the Constitution. Just follow these experts. They know what we should do, and they'll tell you what to do. Yeah, that's how this country was founded. There's lots of other equity of outcome programs coming, and I could actually go on and on forever, and we'll run out of time, but we ought to be terrified. The federal government can and will do anything at this point. So what's happened, I showed this pyramid of power earlier, where, us at the bottom, we had most of the power, most of the freedom, most of the authority in this country. We've got almost nothing now. This monster called the federal government is now the 800-pound gorilla in the room. They're telling everybody what to do. They're sucking up all the wealth, and if they're not sucking it up through taxation, they're just printing it to do whatever the heck they want. Our whole concept of government, the whole concept of federalism is completely upside down right now. So again, here's another spot where I'm going to be blunt. Merely electing Republicans and sending them to Washington is not going to fix this problem. And I don't say that to be anti-Republican Party. I just say that because this monstrosity in Washington that's controlled by the elites and all their allies in the big tech world and the big media world and the cultural world, it is so powerful now. They have so much money. They have such a big bureaucracy. The FBI and Homeland Security can do miserable things to you. The media can frame whatever the government wants them to frame, that it doesn't matter who we send to Washington at this point. We could send Thomas Jefferson to Washington, and he's not going to change what's happening in Washington right now through Washington. I'm not saying we can't fix this problem. I'm saying sending people to Washington to change it through Washington is not going to work. That show is over. And I say that with a fair amount of personal history that has really frustrated me, because I was, as was mentioned at the beginning, I was part of the Tea Party movement in 2009 and 2010. And we energized a lot of people. I thought we put a good vision out there. I think we really were the ones that drove the shift from a Democratic administration over a few years to a Republican administration in Washington. And some of the overreach that we saw in Obama's term, yeah, I thought, oh, good. Now we're gonna turn the ratchet and it's gonna unscrew this. No. I'm gonna show you a couple of charts in a minute that says this ratchet effect that I described earlier is now all powerful. That it's not, who we send to Washington is not gonna affect this problem. So you've seen this chart earlier, but I'm gonna talk about it with a slightly different spin. I originally talked about it as an increase in spending over time, and that's what it is. But you'll notice that there's red bars and there's blue bars on the chart. So the red bars are the Republican administrations, the blue bars are the Democratic administrations. Look at that chart and tell me where we've unwound any of this stuff. No matter who we send to Washington, even guys like Reagan, we didn't really shrink the federal government during those terms. It isn't going to happen. And it's gone so far that it's obscene. We are not going to shrink it by sending different people to Washington right now. And again, if you look at this other chart that I showed about federal regulations, look at that chart and tell me which was the Republican administration that reduced the regulations in this country. It didn't happen. It never happened. It's never going to happen. We're not going to send anybody to Washington that is going to change Washington. Am I offending anybody yet? And I know there's some people who have an affection for Trump, and full disclosure, I voted for him twice. And I actually liked how he presented himself in terms of the Washington elite. He liked to stick his fingers in their eyes. Well, I want to do that too. So I like Trump. He was a bit of a populist. I think he understood us. But it didn't matter. Trump went to Washington, in my opinion, got his ass kicked by the bureaucracy there. And oh, by the way, if you look at spending, under Trump's administration, we had the biggest increases in spending in history under Trump. So again, I'm not picking on Trump. My point is a bigger one. Washington is out of control, and there's nothing we're going to do through Washington to fix that problem. If you think about what Washington is right now, it's a class entirely unto itself. You've got these people who believe they have a right to tell us what to do. They believe that's their mission in life. They have almost infinite money at their disposal. There's nobody politically that will stop them because the Constitution is dead in Washington. All these checks and balances are gone, and they've allied themselves with the elites, the other elites in our society. You look at the big tech companies like Facebook and Google, and all those people are aligned with them. The media is aligned with them. The education establishment is aligned with them. The cultural establishment in our country is aligned with them. It is, like I said, a class entirely unto itself, and it's a class of elites, and it's them against the rest of us. It's the elites versus everyone else, and they control Washington, and we don't. So that's what we need to think about what we're going to do. The insulting part of it is there's hardworking people in the states, lots of us, who work hard. We send our tax money to Washington, and like I said, those bureaucrats just take their cut, they give it out to their cronies. We get a little bit back, but it's always with strings attached. So it's become a creature that's so big and powerful that we can't reform it. It's unreformable at this point, and it's no longer constrained by the checks and balances of the Constitution. I'll give you all day, and you can tell me what check or balance of the Constitution is really going to slow this monster down. There's one. It's called states' rights. If you think about it, all the other checks and balances that I talked about earlier, like the three branches of the government, the bicameral legislature, the veto power, the judiciary, take your pick, they're all part of the DC establishment now. So those checks and balances are actually part of the problem now. However, the states are not in Washington. The states actually created the federal government. The federal government did not exist until the states got together and said, we want to create a federation. So the states are outside of that nexus of power and ultimately are going to be the agents of change for the people here. Part of that reason is citizens have more direct control over the state government than the federal government. It's part of the concept of subsidiarity. The closer government is to you, the more control you have over it, the more you can monitor what they're doing, the more you can give your input into it. There's nothing in Washington. They're not listening to us. I mean, you can say all you want. You can raise your fist, shout, carry a sign. They're not listening. They will never listen to you. And you have no control. You can say, well, I guess I'm not going to send any money to them, and they're going to throw you in jail. Another reason that Washington has become so corrupt is just the whole concept that if 50 states actually had power, real power, it would be much harder to corrupt 50 states. I mean, you know, this cabal of elitists that I talk about in Washington, it's actually fairly easy to corrupt one group like that, to create one nexus of power. But to think you got to do it to all 50 states independently and corrupt them all independently with people who are much closer to those states, yeah, that's a lot harder to happen. Another thing that's important to think about here as a check is if we can create an alliance of states who are willing to push back on the federal government, we actually have some critical mass. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a couple of slides later. But I just want to remind everybody, there's nothing in our Constitution, in our history, or the concepts of individual sovereignty that obliges us to humbly submit to Washington. We simply don't have to do it. Their only real power over us comes through fear and intimidation. And I'll tell you a secret. My belief is there's one thing they fear, one thing only, that those elitists fear in Washington. And that's when millions of people suddenly decide that we don't fear them anymore. And when that happens, when it becomes apparent to the millions of us that are everyone else in this society that we don't have to follow what they're saying. And by the way, they're taking all our money, and maybe we don't have to give them that money. When you've got enough states and millions of people thinking like that, suddenly that cabal of elitists is going to get very, very nervous. So let's talk about states' rights and what does it mean. First of all, there's two amendments. Most people think about the 10th Amendment, but I'm going to throw the 9th into here, and I'll explain why. The 10th Amendment says literally, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So my simpler view of it is that this is all about state sovereignty, that the states, when they created the federal government, said, whatever little power we give you, let's make it perfectly clear. We retain our sovereignty as individual states. And the only power you have are these powers that we specifically grant in our Constitution. That's what the 10th Amendment says. The 9th Amendment is a little different. It says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Well, what does that mean? Well, one of the fears when the Bill of Rights was put together was that, well, people will start to say, well, we gave you the right to assemble, and we gave you the right to free speech, but that means all other rights are retained by the government. No, that's not what it means. It means we listed those just to make damn sure you knew we had those rights. And by the way, we have all the other rights too. So when you think about the 9th and 10th Amendment together, what it's saying is the states reserved all other rights to the states besides what we granted to the federal government, the Constitution. And we as sovereign people retain all of our rights except for the powers that we granted in the Constitution of the federal government. So what this means is we the people retain ultimate power in this society. And we retain that even irrespective of the Constitution. I mean, I'm a follower of the Constitution. I love the Constitution. I think we're down to one thing in the Constitution that can protect us, which is states' rights. But even if you set that aside, we're sovereign people. And as Jefferson reminded us when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, we don't have to accept a tyrannical government. We simply do not have to accept it. And there are some governors that I think are starting to push back. Not as far as I would like them to, but at least they're starting to point the way a little bit, like DeSantis in Florida, Abbott in Texas, Nome in South Dakota. You're starting to see a little bit of resistance by these state governors, and I think we're going to need a whole lot more of that. So you may ask, well, why is it important to have power at the state level and not the federal government level? What's the difference? They're governments, they have power. Well, there's actually a whole lot of reasons why it's more important to have the power at the state level. For instance, each state is unique. If you think about all the states in the country, a state like Hawaii, which is an island way out in the ocean, or a state like Alaska, which is way up north and not very populous, or a state like New York, which has millions and millions of people, they all have different issues and challenges and things they have to deal with. So to impose one solution on the whole country is really wrong, because each of the 50 states requires a different spin on how they have to address their problems. Looking at that a little bit differently, there's 50 state laboratories. When you have 50 state governments and there's a problem in society, each state can approach it a little bit differently, and then we can look at it and say, well, this state tried that, this state tried that, this worked, that didn't work. If you leave everything to the federal government, there's only one thing being tried. And if it's the wrong thing, you're just screwed. You have no way to know if there could have been something better being done. And COVID is actually a good example of that. Each state is more politically sensitive to its local issues, cultures, and values. I've traveled a lot of the country and lived in a lot of different parts of it. On the West Coast, the East Coast, I spent a lot of time in the South, I've lived in the North. Very different country in each of those areas. And the government that people elect should be responsive to those local issues, cultures, and values. I talked about the principle of subsidiarity earlier. I'm not going to beat that to death anymore. One thing to realize that if you put power, if you nationalize power in just one federal government, what part of our country is going to control that power? It's going to be the populous states, and in fact, it's probably going to be most of the urban areas where all the people are. And so if you lose that state sovereignty, and you lose the Electoral College, and you lose senators that are apportioned by state, you basically are going to end up with a country that's simply run by California, New York, and Chicago. And maybe that's good for California, New York, and Chicago, but that doesn't mean that is helpful to anybody else in the country. Another aspect of it is a place for refuge. Like if you have a tyrannical federal government, where do you go? Where do you hide? How do you escape it? I mean, they've got power over everything. If you have 50 states that are sovereign and the one state you happen to be stuck in has gone off the rails, well, you got 49 other options. I'm not saying moving's easy, it's painful, and it may not be the thing for you, but you actually have some place to go if you don't like what that particular state is doing. The last point here is what Patrick Henry called the infinitude of the Constitution. That even though they structured the Constitution with checks and balances, people like Patrick Henry and actually many others at the time said, you know what, give this thing enough time and it's going to devour itself and devour us. And that's what he meant by the infinitude, that somehow, some way, they're going to find reasons, and I sort of went through some of the history of it, they're going to find reasons why we have to increase our power and take it away from you. And Patrick Henry said at some point that will become infinite. We will have lost our state sovereignty and our individual sovereignty. So when you think about this concept of subsidiarity and where do you have influence and where you don't have influence, you have to ask yourself, where do conservatives have power today? If you look at the federal level, the Senate is controlled by Democrats, the House is controlled by Democrats, the executive is controlled by Democrats, and I would argue basically the entire bureaucracy is a left-leaning bureaucracy at this point. If you're a conservative, you don't have any influence. And I would also argue that even if we take the House and take the Senate, the points I made earlier, well, what are you really going to change in Washington through Washington? It's just going to swing back the other way at some point, and the ratchet effect will take over. At the state level, though, we've had a fair amount more success being influential. There's 27 Republican governors and only 23 Democratic. This was really interesting to me. If you look at the legislative chambers, there's 2 chambers in each state, a House and a Senate. The Republicans control 61 of those versus only 39 of the Democrats. And if you look at it as a trifecta where a state controls the governor, the House, and the Senate, the Republicans have 23 of those, where they basically control the entire state government versus 15 of the Democrats. So just looking at this, if you want to apply your political influence, if you got money you want to contribute, if you got time you want to invest to help people, you actually have a lot more influence at the state and a lot more opportunity for success to make a real difference. Another thing that's happening, and to me this is a really important trend, because the country's, I don't know if any of you have ever watched the Harry Potter movies, but they have a thing called the sorting hat, where you sort of, you put the hat on and it tells you what school you're going to go into, whether it's the good school, the bad school, or whatever. America's putting on its own sorting hat. And people are moving between states, and it's an interesting migration. So what this chart shows, in the past slightly over a year, from April 2020 to June 2021, the net migration, and I don't mean births and deaths and people who may have come from other countries, but between states, Florida has had 264,000 move into it from other states. The interesting thing is they've got a Republican governor and a Republican legislature. As you go down this, the states that have gained population from other states are almost all Republican governors and Republican legislatures. If you look at the bottom of the list, I didn't list all 50 states here, but California, New York, and Illinois are the worst, where they've lost population. Like California's lost 429,000 people in the last year. And they basically lost a representative due to the last census. But they're moving to conservative states. And frankly, if I lived in a state controlled by a Democratic governor, a Democratic legislature, I'd probably find a way to move too. But New York lost 406,000 and Illinois lost 152,000, all Democratic governors, all Democratic legislatures. So you're seeing this movement in the country. And in my opinion, it's kind of good news and it's kind of frightening news, because in my opinion, the country's starting to divide itself up. Are we going to have another civil war? I'm not suggesting that, but I think people are starting to think that maybe I ought to get in a place where people think like me rather than they don't think like me. Another really important point here, and I think this is somewhat lost because our history has been to have a powerful federal government for so long now that I think entire generations have grown up thinking, we can't get along without the federal government. I'm here to call BS on that. Every state is a viable political, geographic, and operational entity. They each have their own executive, they each have their own legislature, judiciary, they have functional administrations that can take care of their business. And in fact, they existed before the federal government. They ran their business before the federal government ever existed. We are not dependent on this thing called the federal government. Even more importantly, when you think about economic power, do they have enough economic power to survive if they wanted to stand alone? If California was a country and not just a state, it would have the 5th highest gross domestic product in the world. That if California was a state, only the US, China, Japan, and Germany would actually have a bigger economy than California. The other 200 and some countries in the world are smaller. Texas has a GDP greater than Canada. You look at a map and you say, wow, Canada is this huge thing. It covers half the damn map. Texas's gross domestic product as a single state is greater than Canada's. Same thing with New York. You look at Russia, you look at the map of Russia, they got 180 million people and they cover half the globe too. And you always hear everybody's afraid of Russia, they're gonna take over, they're gonna do this awful thing. New York's GDP is greater than Russia's. Florida's GDP is greater than Mexico's. Even here in Michigan, we're not one of the biggest states, but our GDP is greater than countries that are real countries, and nobody says they can't survive on their own. Austria, Norway, we're bigger than those economies. We have great power. We have fully functional states. We do not have to have Washington in order to move forward or survive. So just to wrap this up a little bit, my opinion is the only possible path to fight the cabal that's in Washington right now is to empower our states. And by that I mean we need to elect people in our legislatures in our states, we need to elect governors, we need to elect attorney generals, we need to elect a secretary of states that believe in individual sovereignty and believe in state sovereignty, and like Noem and DeSantis and Abbott are actually willing to start pushing back. That process is going to take a long time. It may become very tough. I expect some tough times going ahead. But there's no other way to solve this problem than through the states. There is no other way. So that's the end of part one for today. I sort of wanted to set the stage for what's happened with this whole concept of federalism, how we've ended up where we ended up today, and present the idea that the states are really the conduit through which we're going to push back at the federal government. So in part two, which I'm going to talk about in next month's meeting, is you're going to say, okay, well, how? What do we do? What is it that we can do as states to actually push back against this Leviathan in Washington? So we're going to talk a lot about that in our next meeting. I'm going to talk about the 4 E's, which is educate the electorate, some like we're doing today here, where I'm explaining the history of it, the situation we're in, and maybe what we can do. We got to talk about how we're going to do elections. We've elected people that maybe have focused on, at the state level, focused on roads and schools and things like that. I'm not saying those aren't important things, but I'm saying that we need to focus on something that's maybe more important in the grand scheme of things, like, are you going to press back against the federal government or not? That's the thing I want to know when I'm voting in the upcoming election. Are you going to press back against this monster? So we're going to talk a little bit about a short-term vision, like what is it we can do in the 2022 elections that are coming up to start to influence how people think about who they're voting for at the state level. And then a longer-term vision, I want to start to influence other states and groups in other states to start thinking about this too. And at some point in the future, have an alliance of like-minded and independent-minded states that, you know what, when you get a big enough of alliance, you may have enough power to push back seriously at Washington at that point. So in the meantime, our group that we're just starting here has got some things to do. We want to create a social media presence, so we've got a number of things we're working on there. We want to start to network with other conservative groups, not just this one, but around the state, and get them involved in this thought process. This is being videotaped, so we're eventually going to put that online so you can spread it around if you want. And we'll also have a PDF of a file of the presentation slides that you can take a look at and distribute if you want. We're also going to be working on drafting some questions for all the candidates at the state level to get a feel for what is their level of support for states' rights in the upcoming 2022 election. So we do have some assignments. They were mentioned a little bit earlier. First is, hey, if this is an interesting thing to you and you think more people ought to hear about this kind of stuff, please bring a friend or two to the February meeting. Hopefully there'll be parking. Fill out a contact card. All right, there's a list going around, but hey, if you want more information, if you want to be in the loop on how this is developing and how it's evolving, we'd love for you to be involved and get that information. And if it turns out you want to get more actively involved, if you think some of the things we're going to talk about next month as the things that we can do is interesting to you, and you think, wow, that can really make a difference, we'd love for that to happen too. So one of your assignments, you had a card where you're being asked to identify your top 3 states' rights concerns. And again, I'm not looking for you to parrot what I've said here. I mean, I puked out a lot here, and I'm not looking for people just to write down what I thought. We really are interested in things we may have missed as we thought about this, different aspects of where the federal government has overstepped its bounds, different areas where you wish your state legislator and legislators and your state governor would be pushing back at the federal government on particular issues. Just list 3 of them, and it doesn't have to be a treatise. Just give us a few words that makes it clear, this is what's on my mind, this is what's concerning to me. A couple of closing thoughts as we wrap up part 1 here. I've said this already, but I want to repeat it because we need to change how we think about elections here. Because I know a lot of people get excited about what's going on in Washington, and is Trump running? Who should we vote for Republican? Who's our senator in Washington? Who's our representative? And there's probably some value in continuing to think about that, but my opinion is we throw way too much resource, time, energy, and focus on that with no tangible benefit from it, when we really need to think about how we're going to take control over our state. And we need to think about applying our resources there. And by taking over the state, I mean getting a group of legislators, attorney generals, secretary of states and governors, and even the state Supreme Court, who are willing to press the lawsuits, who are willing to challenge the federal government on constitutional grounds, who are willing to even say, we're simply not going to do that, even if you've mandated it as a federal government. We need to think about electing people at the state level who are willing to do that. Is this going to be easy? No. A few words from Thomas Jefferson during the turmoil of the Revolution. He said, a little rebellion is a good thing and is necessary in the political world as storms are in the physical. I think we got a storm coming our way. And then he also said, this is directly from the Declaration of Independence, which to me is a very powerful statement because, again, this was even before the Constitution was crafted. He said, whenever any form of government becomes destructive, and in my opinion, Washington has reached that point, It is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. So the aim of this group that we're starting, Our States, Our Rights, is to ignite a movement that spreads like wildfire to other states in numbers there are strength. And just the last word from Gandhi. I know we're feeling a lot of, if you're like me, you're feeling hopeless sometimes. I look at the news and I think about what's happening in Washington and I say, man, this is really just depressing. But I think we have an opportunity here. I think this concept of states' rights and taking action at the state level and pushing our states to become independent from Washington. And I'm not talking about secession. I'm just saying we're just not going to do what you want, Washington. And as we gather enough numbers, we're going to push back. I think that's an opportunity to get some hope in this process. And as Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. If you want to see a federal government that's not as oppressive, if you want to see a structure of government that respects states' rights and a structure of government that respects individual sovereignty, jump in. Be the change you want to see in the world. So now, I'm going to ask humbly for 2 more minutes, because I am an author. I do write books. My latest one is called 2084 American Apocalypse, and it's not so much a political dissertation as it's a mystery novel. It's actually a novel. It's a mystery. It's fairly interesting in that regard. But it's based on the troubled times that we have, not only starting now, but into the future. So there's some big ideas in there. There's some big political thoughts in there, but it is a novel. It's not just a dry political dissertation. It's sort of like reading 1984 or Atlas Shrugged. There's a lot of deep political thoughts in there, but they're also very interesting novels. And really what the book does is it takes a look at what's happening currently in America. And if we do nothing different, and what I'm suggesting we do something different, but if we do nothing different, it takes a look at what the world's going to look like in 2084 here. And basically there's a civil war going on in America. It's book 1 of a trilogy. The first book's a little challenging because it talks about sort of all the difficult things that are happening in the world in the year 2084. But eventually, as the series unfolds, it's going to be a basis for hope and meaning and a search for a way to find peace and prosperity in America. So I do have some copies here. They're autographed. They're available for $20. If you want to contact me, there's some contact information if you're interested in reaching out, and I'd love for you to do that.